Curse of the Five Coffins. This is a true story which had been happened in my village 9 years ago. Even until now, everyone got scared when thinking of it. That year, for opening farmlands, our people had to fill a slope at the east of the village. While the excavators were working, there was likely something weird underneath the ground surface. "Mr. James, please come to see." Noah, one of the workers who controlled the excavator, called Mr. James, the construction leader, to check out and bounce opinions from him. Mr. James gazed at what the excavator had dug out. That was a giant coffin there in the middle of the slope. In the countryside, like our village, there were many death burials in the past, so that must have been normal when there was a coffin found like that. Mr. James thought that was not a big issue, so he asked them to continue the work. "This is just a coffin. Dig it out and move it to somewhere." After then, the workers had dug some more coffins at the slope. "Mr. James, there is another here." Another and another coffin had been found. "How come?" Once all those coffins had been found around, Mr. James looked at them and sensed that must have been something wrong. There were 5 coffins in total, and they had been placed in 5 different directions, which looked like 5 petals of a flower. At that moment, Mr. James asked 2 guys to guard those coffins. One guy came to call the mayor, and another guy came to see the blind old man Uncle William. They didn't have to come to William's place. Coincidentally, Uncle William had walked by, the blind William here already. Benjamin let James know. William was James's uncle. He had well known in the village as a great prophet. He could see the dead people. Whenever the villagers got some spiritual or haunted issues, they always came to ask for Uncle William's help. "Who is blind?" "I'm not blind." "What happened?" He objected to people once he heard the others called him blind. He was not blind at all. His vision wasn't good, and he always wore heavy sunglasses, which made him look blind. His nearly blind eyes were extraordinary. They could see the deaths. The assistant took Mr. William to James's place. "Mr. James, as you asked." James hurriedly told Mr. William, "Uncle William, we dug out 5 coffins here. Please help us see if this is a bad sign. If so, how could we handle this?" Uncle William raised his sunglasses, looked carefully at the 5 coffins, then shook his head. "This is not good. It senses not good at all. I could see the strong yin here. All of the people there could sense a heavy atmosphere. Might be that was because of the yin, as Uncle James mentioned. As far as I know, our ancestors had placed 5 coffins as a 5 lotuses petals to placate the yin here. This could not be moved, or else bad thing would come to us." He explained. He added, "Those coffins must be kept like this. If we touch them, every year, we have to sacrifice 5 people. You guys better bury them back." James and all of the workers there got frightened at that moment. If what William was talking about was the truth, that was such a horrible curse. While everyone was talking about reburying those coffins, a familiar voice to them had been raised. "What is happening here? James?" That was the mayor. People there had stared at the mayor and told him, "Mayor, we're unable to fill this place out. We got in trouble. If we move those 5 coffins, our village will have 5 deaths every year, so we better stop here and bury them back." The mayor didn't care about what the workers were talking about. He came directly to James with a serious face. "What is that? How could you believe a prophet and slow down our job? But in this situation, I don't know what to do, so I came to Uncle William to find a solution," James faltered. "What a superstitious. We're living in modern life. You don't have to listen to an old prophet like that. Let's continue to conduct the filling progress." As a result, James had to lead the excavators team to move 5 coffins out. "Guys, let's continue our jobs, move those 5 coffins to the cemetery." At that moment, Uncle William tried to stop them in panic. "No, You gotta listen to me, don't move them out. But the excavator team had picked those coffins up. Uncle William, that was Mayor's command. We had to finish our job, could you please step out? No, James. If you do this, you gotta regret. Enough. Uncle William, I need my job. You should head back. James asked his assistant Benjamin to take him home afterward. Benjamin, take him home, please. Uncle William insisted and didn't want to leave. He nearly screamed out and yelled at them when he saw those coffins had been picked up. Please, stop there. Trust me. We have to sacrifice 5 men every year. You gotta regret this. Even Benjamin and another young man had pulled him out, but Uncle William still tried to yell those words. No one listened and believed him. He was unable to change. The trucks had pulled those coffins to the cemetery. Shortly, the slope had been filling to be farmland, which was all the beginning of the disaster. That year, there were actually 5 people who had died. The first one was Oliver, a fisherman. He used electricity for fishing, brought a 100 to 500 voltage battery in his body, and used 2 bamboo sticks to electrify the water, making an electric field around him. Fishes would get an electric shock and be paralyzed so that he could collect them easily. He had been fishing for 2 years. He had never made mistakes, but weirdly, that night, he had been shocked by his voltage battery. Oliver got paralyzed then died instantly. The following day, people saw his dead body was floating in the river. He still brought the voltage battery in his body. The second one was a young man. His name was Noah. He was working at a cooperative agriculture day by his motorbike. There was a turn in Noah's way home. Noah was born and raised in the village. He had driven through that turn 1,000 times, but he got an accident that particular day. His motorbike's wheels had been outed of its rail. He felt out, and his head had hit a rock in the street, instantly died. The third case was Lucas. He had a happy, harmonized family, and abundant life. One morning, his wife had not seen him. She thought her husband had gone to work as usual, but she had scared to death when stepping out of the house. She saw her husband hanging himself in front of their doorstep. That was terrible. His death was too sudden. No one could explain the reason. At that moment, people started to notice and discussed that they were supposed those deaths must have related to the 5 coffins earlier. There were 3 deaths consecutive in our village. There was also some positive thinkings, just coincidences. I don't think so. Before those coffins had been dug out, our village was very peaceful, wasn't it? There have been no funerals in a few years already. But all of a sudden, 3 people have died. This must be so unusual. Yeah, this is so horrible. The others started to be scared as well. Finally, they tended to see the mayor. We have to talk to the mayor. Some of them came to see the mayor. They knocked on the door. What do you guys want? The mayor came out. People worriedly told the mayor their opinions. Our village got 3 unexpected deaths already. That just because of the 5 coffins earlier, mayor. Right, there would be 2 more deaths soon. We came here to let you know. You have to come to see Uncle William. There is only him know how to fix this. The villagers worried who could be the next ones to die. Everyone could be the next ones. Everyone feared that they might be themselves. The mayor got irritated with them. He strolled with the 2 hands clasped behind his back. Listen, don't keep that backward tradition and mindset. The 3 deaths recently were just unexpected accidents. I know no one wanted that to happen. If I heard one more about this trash talk again, you would take your punishments. People had been disappointed after hearing the mayor's words. One by one had left his house. They had thought that was a serious situation. They came to see the blind William. If the mayor doesn't take this seriously, we gotta find Uncle William by ourselves. Let's go. Right. Only William could give us the solution now. Let's go find him. Then some of them brought cigarettes, wines, and fruits to the blind William. He was so surprised when people came to see him. "What are you doing? What happened?" "Uncle William, we come here today and give you those offerings. We all know there are only you could help us to resolve the curse about the 5 coffins." The leader was on behalf of the villagers to tell him what happened. They were so afraid about the others' deaths, so insisted the old man break the curse. As usual, he would give a happy smile and willingly help, but that time was different. He dismissed them. "No way I could help you. I was unable to break the curse." Villagers begged him by any prices. "Uncle William, how could you say that? There is no one, but you could help us, please. How could you stand there and see your people got haunted and die every year?" Uncle William explained, hopelessly. "First didn't say I don't want to help you. I said I was unable to help, that had been set. I'm unable to change. The yin is too strong now. Nothing could settle it down. Just hope God would bless us." People continued to convince the fortune teller, but he was so determined about unable to help. Finally, no hope. Even Uncle William got no solutions. "We gotta wait for the disaster to come by." At that moment, Uncle William started to tell his predictions. "This is gonna be fine. It will be ended in the next 2 years. I could see it's gonna end after the next 2 years. There would be a change in our village. All of the people who have seen the 5 coffins moving that day will all die. I'm unable to see what happens next because I'm one of them. I'm gonna die before its end." That year, John had died. He had fallen out from the mountain on his way to pick the herbs. The 5th dead was Anthony, a truck driver. He passed away after an accident, so there really 5 people for that year. The second year, 5 people who had been there at the moving coffins day had dead, as Uncle William said. That year, Uncle William had passed away because of his lung cancer. There was indeed a change. That village then turned to be a place for execution. The sinners had been taken there for execution by firing squad. Every year, executions had been taken there. People realized that there were always 5 executions every year. They don't know that is just a coincidence or curse. The drowned body. When I was 9 years old, an unforgettable event came to me, which is still stuck in my mind. That year, my family still lived in the village. We had not yet moved to the city. That was a small and quiet village. There were not many people there, so everyone loved each other. There was a small river behind the village. Every afternoon, women in the village would go to wash their clothes at the river. Some of them had brought ducks to raise there. No one would have been greedy to another, so people didn't worry about losing their ducks there. To little kids like us, the river was like a paradise. We could jump there, swam, and play around whenever we like, especially when it was hot. In summer, we came to the river more than usual. Even in the winter, we also would like to try the cold water for a few minutes there. Kids in our village were very into the river. This had happened during that particular summer, when I was 9 years old. I have been unable to forget those terrible memories up to now. That afternoon, after helping my mom set the table up, then had lunch and washed dishes, I ran to my neighbors and persuaded them to come to the river. As usual, I came with James and Noah. We were playing under the water excitedly. Then suddenly, I looked back to the riverbank and saw someone's red slippers there, on top of a rock in the riverbank. I called my 2 friends and pointed out towards the red slippers, but excepted for us under the river, there was no one around at that moment. We were confused about who might be the owner of those red slippers. Looked carefully, those were girls' slippers. The owner must have been older than us a few years. I had seen some of the older girls in the village wore that kind of slippers. I got an idea. Let's hide them. Look around for a while, but we still saw no one, so one of us tended to hide those slippers out. I had no idea why he could think of that bad idea. We had never hidden or taken anyone's stuff yet. But what for? At first, they tended to take the slippers away. There was no one but came to think of it, why we should take those girly slippers, even we could wear inside our house, but if our parents found out, we might be showered by scolds. Alright, this is gonna be a big prank, and it's gonna be fun. After a few discussions, we decided to hide the slippers. Where should we hide it? What do you think? We wanted to hide a secret somewhere, but it should be enough for the owner could find it. After careful discussion, Noah came out of the water to hide them around the riverbank. We finally could find a proper place to hide it. Noah went to a bush nearby and put the slippers inside. After hiding, he backed to the river with us, but I got anxious and kept an eye on the riverbank weirdly. We had waited a long time then, but no one came to find those slippers. Weirdly, the red slippers looked new and very lovely. I didn't know why there was no one came for them then. Time flew by. I didn't mind much about that and continued to play out with my friends, but then, I got an unsecured feeling as if someone was watching us from underneath the river. The insecurity feeling had grown more and more in me. I had been crazy about that feeling as if there was someone tended to hold my legs and dragged down to the river that made me scared. My heart got a bit shaken. What wrong? I'm cold. I don't want to swim anymore. The annoyance kept appearing around, so I wanted to head back. It feels like there is someone under the water who is watching us. I suddenly spitted out those feelings to my friends. Me too. I'm a bit scared of it. I don't want to be here anymore. Noah also got the same feeling as mine. After seeing me return to the river bank, he told James and followed me. You two cowards. There was only James left there, he kept teasing us. After a few minutes alone in the river, James also came back. I wondered if he sensed something like me and Noah, why he was so calming. Then each of us headed home. On that particular night, I was turning and tossing. I got tired and unable to sleep. When I could conk out, I got a nightmare. In the dream, I was standing at the river bank with my friends. That was at dawn. There was no one else, and everything was so quiet. I wondered why I was at the river at that moment, why I thought that was a dream. Weirdly, while I was drowning in my thoughts, I heard a rustle nearby. I curiously came closer to the river. I guess that might be someone's footsteps. I came closer and saw a girl. She looked older than me a few years. She was digging bushes around the area, and likely to look for something. I stood there watching her looking for a while. She didn't seem to care for my existence until I got bored and tended to walk away. She heard my footsteps and turned to me. Her face was so pale. Her eyes were black and went haywire, lifelessly. She didn't seem like a human being. Her face freaked me out, so I stepped back a few steps. I could be clearly sure I was standing in the middle, more than a meter behind her and a long distance in front of the river. Still, I was unsure how I could fell to that familiar river. The more I struggled, the deeper I sank into the river, but noticeably, I didn't run out of breath. In opposite, I could breathe normally and glare at someone who was observing me from underneath. I gave another look that turned out the scary girl I had met earlier. She was staring at me with her deadly face, which really scared me to death. I screamed out and awakened at that moment. That was simply a scary nightmare. Then I was tossing and turning the rest of the night. The following day, I bore panda eyes and went to school. After classes, I waited for James and Noah to come home together. I forgot to tell you, James and Noah weren't my classmates back then. I had waited for a while, and I just saw Noah but not James came out that day. My classroom was downstairs. Their classrooms were next to each other, and they were joined at the hip, but that day, there was no James. James's parents have called to ask for him a day off. I heard that he is sick, probably he has a fever." That was really weird, so I had asked Noah about James, and he replied, "I had a dream last night. I saw we came to the river, as usual, then there was a scary girl, then I fall to the water." Noah had asked me why I got my eye circles. I started to tell him my nightmare. "What? You also dreamed that? I got a nightmare as well last night." Noah's face had changed after hearing about my nightmare. He also had a nightmare the night earlier. Noah told me that he dreamed he came to the small river, saw the girl, and fell to the water. Just like mine. That was impossible. No way we dreamed the same like that. I'm wondering if James got the same dream as us? We were wondering what about James. We had been hung out the day earlier. So, did he dream like us? We were deducing a bit. We suddenly remembered the red slippers hidden in the bush. The girl must have looked for those slippers. We had glared at each other for a while. After that, we decided to come to James's place to clarify if he dreamed about that girl. If so, that was not a good sign at all for all of us. We rushed to James's house. James's parents had gone to the market for their business, so there was only him in the house by himself. James opened the door and welcomed us to his home. He looked really not well. Noah and I went straight to the point. Accordingly, we told him about our nightmare, and as our thought, James had the same one. He had a fever in the morning afterward. So the girl came to find her slippers which we have hidden? We were all unable to remember how the girl in our dreams looked like. We were just too frightened to remember, at that moment since we had seen the same detail in our dreams. Might be she tried to go into our dreams to warn us to return her slippers. We gotta return her slippers to where it was. We need to end that kinda nightmare and didn't let the girl chase us to our dream. We agreed to return the slippers back. We hurriedly ran to the river. James came with Noah and me even though he got sick, but he tried to go after us. Once we reached the river, we were amazed. Villagers were gathering around. People didn't usually gather that much typically, so that must have been something happened. When coming closer, we saw a dead body, and everyone brought the body to the riverbank. We were curious who could that be. Once we could see the dead body's face, which made us scared to death, we realized that was the girl in our dream last night. There was a sprayer in her back. Her body had been buried then by her family. After everything had been handled, people had left, we came to the bush where we hidden her slippers, took them out, and put them back to the rock as us, then hurriedly left as well. When I got home, I heard people were discussing her death. That was Smith's daughter. That day, she was working. As usual, she brought the sprayer to spray pesticide. After finishing her job, she went to the river to wash her legs, but unfortunately, she had fell to the river and died. She was bringing the heavy sprayer at the moment she fell. On top of that, she didn't know how to swim, so she struggled in the water for minutes, then drowned in the river and died. The day she died was the day we had found the slippers and hid them out. When Noah and I were swimming around, we had a bad feeling, just because the girl died under our feet in the river. After we returned the red slippers, the following day, in the morning, we tried to go to the river early on the way to school. We realized that the red slippers had been disappeared. That might be there was someone took them away, or might be the girl had been taken it back. And after the red slippers event, we didn't even come out to the river ever. The Old Man and the Aquatic Monster. This is what I have heard from my mom, and my mom had heard from my grandma. My mom told me that my grandma was a good storyteller. Her stories had made her a great childhood. My mom has an older brother, Uncle William, and a younger brother, Uncle Jack. When they were children, every night, under the dim oil lamp, They always gathered around her so that she would tell her 3 kids' stories while she was mending their clothes. Today, I'm gonna tell you a story about a monster. My grandma had started the story like that. Monster? Where does it live? How does it look like? Does it eat human beings? Every time my grandma started to narrate, her kids bombarded her with that kind of question. Those little kids were overexcited and curious about what could happen in a thrilling story. Stay tuned. If you guys keep interrupting like that, I'm not able to continue. My grandma always tried to calm down her children. If you guys don't stay put, I am going to stop the story here. She pretended to be unhappy so that her kids could stay put and stop to ask. They wanted to hear the story. And then she started the story with her light, steady voice in front of the dim oil lamp. She was mending clothes while telling her story. The story was about Smith's family in a small village. Smith's family lived in a small village. Mr. Smith lived with his son and his daughter-in-law. His family had got a curse for 3 generations. They had only a child. What is a curse? Uncle William stopped my grandma there. He was a little child then and unable to understand what a curse is. A curse is magic that intended to bring bad luck to people. In this case, Smith's family had been cursed for having only a son for 3 generations. My grandma had stopped and explained. After explaining, she threatened her kids, "If you dare to interrupt me another time, I'll put a curse on you." All of them were scared out, so they tried to keep silent and listen to her story. Smith's daughter-in-law had been pregnant. Everyone hoped that would be a beautiful cutie son to perpetuate their family lineage. But then, that was the most disappointing moment for their family, because the day the child was born, everything was not like they had expected. That particular day, while Mr. Smith had been smoking at the front yard, his wife came to him and announced that their daughter-in-law had given birth to a little girl. Mr. Smith had put the cigarette down and given a light sign. "Common, let's come in to welcome our little granddaughter to her life. I know you are unhappy, but you have to take a look at your granddaughter, don't you? Don't let our kids down." Mrs. Smith reminded him. Once Mr. Smith entered the room, his daughter-in-law was resting in the bed. His son, Lucas, was overexcited, happiness visible on his face. He was holding his first baby. "Dad, look at my little daughter. She is your granddaughter." Lucas quickly brought the baby in front of his father. He was on cloud 9. At the moment Mr. Smith saw his little granddaughter, all of his sorrow had been likely to go away. He gave a big smile. She was such a cutie little granddaughter to Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith reached his hand to hold his granddaughter. Mrs. Smith and Lucas were all really a relief and very emotional with that. They knew he always had expected a grandson, but that did not matter anymore. The whole family had welcomed an angel full of joy. Time flew. The little granddaughter had been grown up. She learned how to walk and could say her first words. Her name is Emma. She loved his grandpa the most. She followed him everywhere and called him aloud, "Grandpa, Grandpa." "Are you hanging out with your granddaughter?" That was Oliver, his neighbor. He was taking his grandson for a walk. "Oh, little Emma, such an adorable girl. Notwithstanding, your grandpa used to always ask your parent gave him a grandson. He didn't like a granddaughter." Mr. Smith didn't want to hear those words. That was as if people were cursing that his family would have no son to perpetuate their family lineage. Later on, his daughter-in-law could give him another grandson. Even though he didn't like that, the old Smith pretended to smile and then took Emma to another place. He usually took his granddaughter to the river for fishing. His neighbors usually teased him, "Mr. Smith, are you going to go fishing with your granddaughter?" People said that he didn't want a granddaughter, so he was so embarrassed when having her. He didn't want to talk to anyone, so he took Emma to the river to avoid his neighbors. But those all were a rumor. At that moment, he loved and treasured his little granddaughter. But those gossips had continued every day. If I were you, I would take your granddaughter to the middle of nowhere, and choked her to death, then demand your son to give me a grandson. No way he could have a son. Many people had joked about Smith's family curse. Those trash talks weren't fun. One day, the old Smith and his granddaughter went to the river as usual, but they weren't back yet when it was getting dark. His wife and son got butterflies in their stomachs, which was out of the ordinary, so they headed to the river to look for them. Once reaching the riverbank, they saw a mess there. The fishing pole and their pot were lying on the ground, disorderly. There were a few dead fishes there, but Smith and his granddaughter were nowhere to be found. His wife and son sensed something unsecured. They called the old man and the little girl aloud, "Dad! Emma!" Their calls echoed around the river. After a few moments, they saw the old man came out of the water. "What are you going?" Mrs. Smith wondered. Lucas came close to him and asked worriedly, "Daddy, where is Emma?" But there was just silence replied them. Mr. Smith held a deep breath then dived back to the river. "Quick, come and pull your father back here." Mrs. Smith didn't feel right. The son took off his shirt quickly and jumped out to the river. He swam to Mr. Smith. "Daddy, where is Emma? What happened?" The old Smith was terrifying. He tended to dive down one again, but his son had asked. He hardly kept his breath and answered, "Emma. She is under the water. I have to find her. Let me find her." "What, Dad? Why is Emma under the river? How did this happen?" Lucas had panicked. He thought that his daughter had fell to the river, but the old Smith assured, "That was a monster, it dragged our Emma to the water." Lucas thought that his father had been too panicked to have a clear mind at that moment. He talked nonsense. The son asked for young men in the village to find his daughter all night. If she had died, they would find her body, but they had found nothing after the whole night of looking. "Dad, what happened? Please tell me the whole things. Please told us what happened with you and our granddaughter?" Lucas and Mrs. Smith were unable to keep calm. They headed home and asked the old man sitting powerlessly in his bed. Mr. Smith had started to tell them what happened at the river that day. There was an aquatic monster appeared. As usual, the two granddaughter had come to the river. They hoped they could fish big fishes that day. Being at that age, the old man had been uncomfortable with his knees when sitting a long time, so he stood up to make his legs better. Mr. Smith walked around and reminded his granddaughter to stay put and wait for him to come back. Emma was an obedient kid. She had not moved. Sometimes, she touched the fishes in the pot. The old man was right behind her, stretching his muscles. Suddenly, he felt a cold breeze from the river. He sensed something came out of the river. He turned back, saw a giant creature coming out of the water, made a strong current under the river, came close to Emma, opened its mouth, and swallowed his dear granddaughter in a blink of an eye. The old man rushed back to save his granddaughter. Still, he was late. The aquatic monster was too fast. In a few seconds, it had swallowed his granddaughter completely and dived down to the river. The old man screamed aloud and called his granddaughter name, "Emma, where are you?" Without hesitations, he swiftly jumped to the river to find his granddaughter. His head turned blank, he got panicked, and he repeatedly called Emma. The old Smith kept diving and coming out to take his breath for hours, but he was unable to find his granddaughter as well as the aquatic monster until his son and his wife came. The old Smith tore out. He was suffering from losing his granddaughter in front of his eyes. "I'm a useless piece of shit. I lost her." Everyone had been tearing up as well after hearing what happened. Still, Lucas and Mrs. Smith couldn't believe there would be an aquatic monster that could swallow Emma. Since then, Mr. Smith was likely to be withered. He stayed up multiple nights. His hair and beard had turned gray after a few days. Every day, he sat at his doorstep and smoked alone. He had not spoken a word to anyone. His accident had been spreading around the village, and a nasty rumor had been started. They said the old Smith had killed his own granddaughter. He didn't like a girl to be his granddaughter, and all he told just a lie to cover his sin. That rumor had reached the old man. One day, people saw him. After days of being at home, he came out to the market and bought lots of ropes and iron stakes. Once he backed home, he kept his silence and locked him up in the storage. The family was curious about that. Disregards, his wife had convinced him to open the door, but he did not answer a word. There were just rattle from the storage every day. Mrs. Smith brought him meals every day, but he just had a little, then got back to the storage. His wife was so afraid of him, she cried her eyes out at the door. "Please, come out. Our Emma had gone for a while. Everything had been over. We gotta move on." On the fourth day of being in the storage, he opened the door and stepped out. There were a bunch of ropes on his shoulder. He held a big, sharp iron hook, looked terrified. He was saying no words, came to the pig pen. Mrs. Smith followed him. "Dear, what are you going?" He was so determined. "I'll kill that aquatic monster. How dare it swallowed my dear granddaughter. Are you insane?" Hearing he talked nonsense, his wife thought he was out of his mind, but she was unable to stop him. He dropped the rope on the ground and come into the pig pen with the iron hook. "That's right. I'm crazy. I gotta take revenge for Emma." He gritted his teeth and used the hook to tab one of the pig's neck. The pig screamed out. His reaction made his wife falling down to the ground. Frozen, she looked at his pale shadow. Everyone who saw him would be scared to death on the street. Looked like he wanted to kill someone. He carried the rope on his shoulder. On top of that, there was an iron hook on his hand. It was hooking to the pig's head, which was bleeding under his feet. The news spread around the village shortly. Everyone got excited and curious. They all came to the river to see. Mr. Smith nailed a giant wooden pole in the river bank. He wrapped the rope around it, set the knot, and tightened it. At the other end of the rope, he hung the iron hook with the pig's head in. He threw it down to the river. It turned out he used that pig's head as a monster lure. Everyone in the river bank had gossiped about that. One said that Mr. Smith might be crazy. Another said he had talked the truth. Emma had been eaten by the aquatic monster. Once he threw the pig's head to the river, he quietly sat in the riverbank. His back was on the pole and wait for the aquatic monster to come, but after a long while, there was nothing happened. He is really out of his mind. What monster? This is bullshit. Yeah, I agreed. He just made this up. It was nearly a day passed by, but nothing happened. People had been waiting with him from the daylight to dawn, then they all left. There was only Smith left there at the river bank. He patiently sits in silence. His eyes gazed at the water. His face was getting withered. For days, he didn't drink water. His eye sockets were deepened. His lip got cracked. He pursed his lip and wait. He was getting weak. His eyelids became heavier, then he passed out. Being drowsy, he heard his little granddaughter's voice, "Grandpa, Grandpa." "Wow, Grandpa, we got a fish already." That was her familiar voice every time they went fishing, and that made him awake. Mr. Smith Jolt awoke. He saw the rope was tightened. He thought that the monster had fallen to the bait. The rope was pulled by the monster under the water. That must have been a mighty monster. He could sense the giant aquatic monster down there. It was trapped in his hook, and the monster tried to escape the hook. The rope had been pulled violently by the monster. The old man tried to hold it tightly in despair. The aquatic monster was more potent than him. The rope had been pulled violently to the water. The old man tried to hold the rope tightly so that he was dragging and scratched, his palms got bleeding, but he kept having the string. The old smith buried his feet in the ground so that the monster was unable to make him move an inch. He used all of his strength. He was so determined to revenge the enemy which had to swallow his granddaughter. He gritted his teeth tightly. He told himself that he would never let that monster go. But as a human being, he was nearly dragged into the river multiple times, but he kept forcing. He turned his body and squeezed the rope on his shoulder. He tried to pull the cord towards the pole. He got multiple whips on his back. His body was bleeding. He knew that he could not fight the monster any longer like that, so he tried his best to tie the rope to the pole. He tried to tie the rope some more around the pole, then he leaned his whole body to the pole so that the monster didn't pull him away. The pole had been buried deep in the ground, so the monster could not escape from that. It thrashed around. The monster had stuck in the hook as well, been unable to escape or swim away. It made some big weird sounds. The following day, people came to his spot to check out. They saw the old man was leaning on the pole. Look, the old smith is still there. Come there. Once they came closer to him, they had been astounded. The old man had been so exhausted, but he still tried to hold the rope on his shoulder. Scratches and dried blood were all over his body. There was likely a heavy fish in the other end of the rope. One of them had pulled the rope and sensed a heavy thing. Then they called for some more strong guys to help him to pull the rope. They were all feeling the heavy weight. What is this heavy? People together had pulled it out of the water. It turned out just a giant catfish. Holy shit. How come the big catfish exist? It must be a monster. That's it. Looks at the mouth. It could swallow a human being. People were amazed about the catfish. No one had seen a big one like that ever. The villagers had ripped open its belly to see what the catfish could eat. In the belly, there were lots of bones from human beings and animals. They had no idea if Emma's bones were among that stuff. But being eye-witnessed, Mr. Smith had caught that monster. Everyone had believed what he told earlier, that catfish obviously capable of eating his granddaughter. Alright, this is the end of our story today. Whenever my mom remembered those stories from my grandma, they were very much alive and attractive. There were always good and bad people in her stories. There was always a discussion of my grandma's kids afterward. The old smith was miserable. No one believed him in the first place. Kids always remembered carefully and believed those thrilling stories. Do you think people or monster is the scarier? After finished every story, my grandma always asked them a question. I think that was how my grandma educated them. Uncle William promptly responded, "The monster is scarier. It could eat human beings in a blink of an eye. Human being is strong as well. The human being could beat and kill the monster as Mom's story," my mom added. "Nah, I think the hatred and rumors are more horrible." Uncle Jack had an outstanding thought. He thought rumors are the most horrible things. It could kill people. And then, a loud discussion had started among them. They all wanted to protect their points. My grandma always smiled at them. Bedtime. She didn't indicate who was right and who was wrong. But even it was bedtime, her kids didn't stop the discussion about the story, the monster, the old man, and the gossips from the villagers. My grandma always ended up a story by yelling at her kids, "Stop. Close your eyes and go to sleep. Stop talking, or else you will get spanking." The story about my father. Everyone said everything in this world is just temporary. I could not understand that until I grew up. I think people said they cannot know when the Ripper would take their lives or their loved ones away. This story is about my father. This happened during my summer vacation when I was in 7th grade, which was my second year in middle school. As the other teenagers, we explored everything. Everything was attractive to us. Even though I had lots of summer homework from school, I barely touched it in the summer until a week before the school day. Countryside teenagers like us were very naughty and creative to think about what to play out, so there were non-stop games throughout the summer. My family was a poor one in the village. My mom had a broken leg after an accident, so she could not move like ordinary people. Fortunately, people had arranged a job for her to boil the water in the hospital. My father worked in a coal mine, from 7 a.m. to midnight. My duty in the family was taking care of my 6-year-old sister. She was very kittenish. She might ask me to carry her on my back from place to place all day long. So every time I wanted to hang out with my friends, I had to take her along. That day, after finishing my breakfast, I prepared to run outside hurriedly since I had an important meeting with the boys in the village to go to the river. Once I stepped out of my room, suddenly, a hunch told me to step back. I saw my father was sitting on the chair in the living room. Back then, I thought my father was very rigorous. He would never allow me to enjoy my free time with my friends. He wanted me to study hard. He silently watched me study. Sometimes he brought me a cup of water and told me, "My son, you gotta try your best to study. You're poor. You're not a son of the mayor as well, so you have to try harder than the others." My father always reminded me that we were destitute if we wanted to change our life later on. To have a better life, you had to try your best to study. He emphasized, no way rather than study to have a better life. I respected him and was scared of letting him down. If he sat there in the room, how I went out with my friends, I sadly dispelled to think of going out. I came back to my room, took my homework, and started to solve. I hoped my father would leave soon so that I could go out. 20 minutes later, I thought my father had left, so I crept in my door to check out the living room. But that just made me disappointed. He was still there, smoked in silence. My memories are full of his images, especially when he smoked. He was addicted to cigarettes and smoked lots of cheap cigarettes. That might be why I was unable to forget the cigarette smell. It was intense and annoyed me. Sometimes, it made me run out of breath. My mom had convinced him multiple times to withdraw cigarettes. "Honey, we have no money. Why do you still smoke? We could save tons of money every month if you withdraw it. On top of that, cigarettes are kinda toxic. It is not good for our health. Please withdraw it." Every time hearing my mom like that, he was very grumpy. What a big talk. I could withdraw anything but cigarettes, you know. Do you get bored by repeating those words from time to time? We could save in another stuff. My cigarettes are not a big deal. When I grow up, I realized the reason my father had smoked that much. He might be releasing his waves of anger, stress, and sorrows through the smoke. My mom's salary at the hospital didn't help much. My sister and I needed to go to school. My grandmother was on the sick bed, and her medicine fee was also a huge burden to my father. I recently realized my father's burden back then. He had to work very hard. When he got stressed, he just fired a cigarette and smoked in silence. Just like that day, he was sitting on the chair in the living room, under the smoke. I could see his sad face. I guessed he was unhappy with something. I didn't have enough courage to piss him up. I returned to my study table and tried to be a good boy by doing my summer homework. But it was not taking long. Half of an hour passed by. My urge to go out was rising again. I was sitting in the chair but felt like I was under fire. I was so discomfort. So one more time, I drew my eye out to see if my father had left. That time, I didn't see him smoking. He was standing in front of our wooden cabinet in the living room. That was an old-fashioned cabinet, which had been made from a well-known carpenter in our village, and was covered by glasses on top. We had placed photos, certificates, and stamps under the glasses for memories. My father stood in front of the cabinet, frozen. He stared at those photos under the glasses. Once I turned back to him another time, and I found it very strange. I saw my father's feet were vaporing. It was fading out and changed to be transparent. I stood there frozen. The more I looked, the more frightened I had. My heart bounced faster. At that moment, I realized my father smoked there for hours, but there were no cigarettes out. And there was no cigarette smell as usual as well. Then I heard his sign. He moved his eyes out of the cabinet. He tended to leave the house. But weirdly, I didn't hear his footsteps. He moved as if he slid on the ground to the doorstep. He was likely to be floating in the air with a weird robotic pose. Finally, he reached the door and passed through the door without opening it. I still was standing there, frozen. I didn't know what was happening in front of me back then. I was wondering if I got dizzy. Suddenly, I heard my sister crying outside. I hurriedly came out and saw my sister was lying on the ground, torn out. I had never seen my sister such in that horrible status. I ran towards her and tried to soothe her, but she pointed to something. "Big brother, Dad is bleeding, very much." I soothed her, comforted her, and asked her what had happened. My sister was choked by tears, told me that she was playing outside the sand dune. Then my father came out. She said his face was covered by blood, very scary. With what I had seen in the house, I sensed something terrible had happened. I carried my sister in my hands and headed out to come to my mom's place. After hearing all of that, my mom tried to calm my little sister down, and she could stop crying. But once I looked at her eyes, she was eyed out, frightened, that obviously, she was panicking. Since the date my father took the mining job, she had never stopped worrying a day. At that time, Uncle Lucas, my father's co-worker, had come to our house. He yelled at my mom, "Emma, your husband had an accident in the mine. Hurry, come with me to the hospital now." He came to deliver a piece of bad news to us. My father had an accident and been brought to the hospital. That was an unexpected accident. Due to a newbie's carelessness, there was a rock falling to his head in the mine. "I gotta go to the hospital first. You two come to Uncle William, then asked him to drive you to the hospital then, hear me?" Uncle Lucas hurriedly drove my mom to the hospital by his motorcycle. Once my sister and I reached the hospital, my dad had died already. People said that when my dad was passing out, he drowsily called my sister and me. Probably he was unable to leave us that soon. He cared too much about us. After then, everything turned back to normal, which was treated as an accident. My father's leaders came to visit and apologize. They all talked to us with some empty words like, "Sorry. Please accept our condolences." Our family got compensation for my father's accident. Everything quickly had been settled down as if it had never happened. At my father's funeral, I had dropped no tears. At that moment, I felt like I was an adult already. I was the only man in the house, so I kept reminding myself I had to be strong, be like my father so that my sister and mom could depend on me. I had never forgotten my father's face that morning, the face of sorrow and sadness, which had been hit me so hard and squeezed my heart out up to now. And his shoulder when he left. He was the strongest man in the world. His shoulder was massive. He could undertake everything in my family. The hard job had curved his shoulder day by day. On that particular day, he probably knew he could not undertake the family anymore, so he bore a sorrowful and hopeless face. Every time that day recalled to my memory, I regretted I didn't give the last word to him aloud, "Dad." He put so much hope in me, so I had tried to keep a high rank in class. I had passed to a prestigious university in my country, then I had packed my bag and gone to the city. My student life had no play out, just learned and part-time jobs. I had to take a part-time job to help my mom out with my tuition fee and the expensive cost of living in the city. I tried to my mom less worried about me, about the money. Currently, I had a decent job and bought a house in the city. I had picked up my mom and my sister to live with me. After all, after my father's funeral, we had lived a great life. Everything was becoming better and better as my father's wishes. I tell you this story, because I saw him last night, in my dream, after a long while. I haven't dreamt about that morning. In the dream, I pulled myself together and called him out when he nearly left, at the doorstep. "Dad. Please stay." My father turned back. The sorrow was likely to be gone from his face. He gave me a light smile and told me, "Son, you have done a great job so far. I could rest in peace now." My grandpa. I was born and raised in a poor village. My parents had left to another place to make a living, so they were so busy taking care of us. I had lived with my grandpa. He had been both father and mother to me. My mom came and picked me up at the weekend. Sometimes, my parents had to take an extra shift. I could not meet them, but that was fine. I had my grandpa by my side then. Everything was just like that until I was in 5th grade. At that time, my mom had changed her job to work nearby. So that she could take good care of me every day, she had come to pick me up from my grandpa's place. Time flew by. My study kept me busy enough to lessen a visit to my grandpa, from visit weekly, to monthly and then one in a few months. Then the following semester, my parents and their siblings had been too busy to put food on the table. So they had no time to come to see or take care of my grandpa. He had to live by himself all alone. I heard my parents discussed sending him to a nursing home. Since my high school was very far away from home, so I barely spent time visiting my grandpa. I only saw him once in a blue moon, just a few times a year. I cared for my grandpa and had a few arguments with my parent about how they took care of him. But come to think of it, my parents were very busy and worked very hard to put food on the table. If there were my grandpa here, there would be tons of stuff that my mom had to worry about. My father would get more headaches since my mom always complained about everything. My parents and their siblings had argued a few times about who would take care of my grandpa. Time flew by until the winter vacation of my 2nd year in university. That year, the snow had fallen more than usual, and there was a snowstorm, so the transportation had been stagnated. I was unable to take any public transportation home and stuck in my dorm. At that moment, there was only me in my room. My roommates all were from very nearby town from the university. They had arranged and left soon. I was in my room alone, watching the snowstorm. Weirdly, I dreamed about my grandpa 2 days in a row. The first time, I dreamed that my grandpa and I walked to hear audiobooks at the cultural house like our old day. When I was a child, my grandpa and I usually came to listen to audiobooks to remember some of them and reread them. In the dream, everything was so real. I was playing ball with my neighbors in the village. My grandpa took me home after listening to audiobooks. He held my hands, and we walked home together. The sun was over our head. My grandpa was like my red sun. I was very proud and happy in the village that I had my grandpa indulge and take care of me. But that was weird. My grandpa's hands were so cold. I tended to ask him out, but I awakened from the dream. That was the first dream, and the following day, I had a similar dream about him. In the second dream, I saw me and my grandpa were sitting and eating together, but he had wines. I was trying to eat quickly to head outside. He was sitting there, drinking cup by cup, and suddenly he turned to me, told me to not worry about him. I faced up to his face. He looked pale as if he was sick. I tended to ask him, then heard an ambulance sound outside. At that moment, I had awakened. I felt very annoyed after waking. My dreams weren't completed. I had dreamed about my grandpa for 2 days straight and sensed something terrible had happened. I wondered if my grandpa was doing well. So, I had called my father, then I heard a noise on the phone. There were irritation and annoyance in my father's voice. It looked like he had been arguing with someone. Then he asked me about how I was doing with my school and dorm. He told me not to worry. For a few minutes, my father talked to me and didn't let me ask him anything. He hung up the phone as if he had an urgency. That night, while I was in my bed, chatting with my friends, there was someone knocked on my door. I came to get the door and wondered who could reach that late, but the door was opening. I was astonished that my grandpa was in front of me. He wore a new, nicer shirt than usual. He was so simple and rarely had a new shirt in my memories. I quickly took him into the room and let him sit in one of the available beds in my room. He gave me a kind smile. I wanted to pour him a drink, but he had stopped me. I don't need anything. Just sit here and talk to me, my dear. I sat in front of him. He was ruddy, looked happier than the last time I had seen him. Grandpa, you look so glad. What makes you happy like this? I could not hold my curiosity. I asked him out. There is a snowstorm outside. How could you get here to find me? What is happening at home? He dispelled. No, nothing happened, my dear. I just wanted to meet you. Since you went to university, I have never come to see you at your school. Then my grandfather had asked me about my student life at my university. He also told me about our family. He looked lonely when talking about our family. I could guess the relationship between my grandpa and his kids wasn't good. That was a bit intense. However, he didn't tell me any sad things. All he mentioned was about the good thing. Hearing I could settle well my student life, he stood up afterward. Time to leave. I gotta go, or I'm gonna be late. I was shocked by his words. I stood up and asked him, Grandpa, where are you gonna go this late? You could stay over tonight. But he headed out already. He was standing at the doorstep when I finished my question. He turned to me. He told me one last time, my dear. If you could go home, don't worry, and don't mind what people say, remember. He stepped out. I hurriedly came after him. I tried to stop him. But weirdly, even I ran very fast but was still unable to reach him. At that moment, I felt a burden on my shoulder, pent-up frustration, and unable to breathe. Lastly, I called my grandpa aloud with all the power I had. The pent-up feeling disappeared. I woke up from the dream. It turned out just a dream, so that was my other dream about my grandpa. Why I had those kinds of weird dreams. I carefully put myself together. There were some minor details in my dream. The most irrational fact was my grandpa's health. With his current condition, he definitely was unable to come to my place by himself. But there was another doubtful detail about the door, why my door was opened. I was very sure I had closed it right after I stepped in. The following day, the snow had stopped falling, which was good news since I could go home then. Fortunately, my friend, who had lived in the same town with me, had been picked up by his family home, so I had asked them for a drive. I had to sit in the car for a whole day long to get home. But once I reached home, my heart was nearly stopped and frozen. I saw a condolence wreath at the main door. There was a mixed feeling inside me. I ran into the house. My grandpa's portrait was put on the altar. There were also white candles and incenses. I immediately realized what happened to me earlier and why I had dreamed about my grandpa. Once my father saw me, he had handed me the white mourning clothes without a word. Then he asked me to bow my head in front of my grandpa's altar. I froze and nodded my head down. All of his images were full in my head. Last night, that was the last time of him in this world. Probably, he was afraid of unable to see me, so he had to go all the way to find me. I walked close to his altar. He had left me forever. I shed tears non-stop. The following day, in the burial, snow still felt a lot. It was cold like my heart. Our relatives had come to escort him to his afterlife. I was the grandson, so I had to lead the way. I had heard some of them buzzing. Look. That was his grandson. He's just pretending, such an unfaithful grandson. He has never come to see his grandpa the last time. His grandpa loves him the most, and in return he is cold-blooded. I could hear those shitting words, but I kept continuing my footsteps. I didn't turn back or objected to them. Since my grandpa's voice was still echoing in my head, he told me not to worry and feel sad when hearing what people talk. And at that moment, I understand what he told me. All I needed to do was escort him to his forever place the last time. That was like he had raised me for my very first walks.